Greetings everyone, this is Ahav Ever from the Chronicles of Ahav Ever, and today's video is going to be dealing with does genetics prove Jewish ancestry according to Torath Mosheh? So the answer to this question, before I've even gotten started, is no. Okay, thank you everybody, bye-bye. Okay, now I could just leave the video like that, but I won't, so I'll explain what I mean exactly by saying no. That DNA or genetics does not prove out Jewishness in terms of Torath Mosheh. So the more detailed answer is the following. Again, as I've mentioned in a previous video, Torath Mosheh is all ancient, authoritative, and authentic historical texts, concepts, judicial rulings, practice, and traditions that trace directly back to the singularity of the giving of the Torah at Mount Sinai as it was transmitted from Hashem to Moshe ben Amram and all of Am Yisrael, the people of Israel, and has been preserved by their descendants who are from the most ancient communities of Mizrahi, Temeni, Sephardic, Maghrebi, and Ashkenazi Jews. So, in order to explain what I mean about the idea that genetics don't prove Jewishness, let's take it from an outside particular concept first of all. On the left, you have, I guess you could say, a wall painting that was found in Egypt. It's more than about probably 3,000 years old, and it's of a man who's a Nubian. And again, this is the Egyptians painting a neighbor of theirs nationally, someone from Nubia. And on the right side, you have a Nubian man from about 1910. The picture on the right is from 1910. The carving or the painting on the left is from about 3,000 years ago. So the question could be, can the man on the right side, who is in the picture from 1910, genetically prove that he is from the descendant of the person on the left side, which is just a wall painting? Can that be proven genetically? And the answer to that is, basically the question I should say is, how does one prove a genetic connection between the two of them? So essentially, the only way you could really prove a connection to them is to have some kind of DNA test that's performed on the man to the left as well as the man to the right. But the basic problem that I think that should be pretty evident to see is that if all you have is a painting or a drawing or like a carving of a person that maybe existed several thousand years ago, and you have an actual person that exists like in the more present era, unless you have DNA material from both of them, there's no way to prove that they're genetically connected to each other. So what do I mean by that? Let's take this scenario where on the left you may have someone who's like a mummified body that was left over, and you want to make that comparison with that man that we were showing on the right side. In this situation, if the mummy has genetic material or physical body, physical material in the body that can have DNA extracted from it, and if you had the DNA of the man on the right, for example, and you perform a DNA test, and if the test shows you that within a certain percentage, within a certain time frame, that they are genetically linked to each other, then you can show a genetic connection between the two. But again, a DNA test isn't going to tell you that the man on the left or the body on the left is the person on the right's great-great-great-great-grandfather. At the most, it may say that they are genetically related to each other within a certain percentage, from an ancestor several thousand years earlier, but it's not going to specifically tell you that these people are connected ancestrally directly from, let's say, first cousins, parents, grandparents, things like that. It doesn't give you that kind of information. So basically, the reason why I'm even bringing this up is because I've had people come to me in some of my videos and leave comments saying that they are descendants of Abraham through genetics, that they have genetic markers of Abraham and things like that. And the reality is that from a halakhic Jewish perspective, a Torath Mosheh perspective, we don't go by that as our rulings in terms of saying that we're related to someone in those kind of methodologies. And I'll explain why that is in just a second. But I found that this answer on yeshiva.org to be a good answer. When someone asked about genetics and how it plays out in terms of Jewish law, the rabbi who responded gave the following answer, that the questions are, can DNA testing be a halakhically valid proof of descent and therefore of your Jewishness? Is there really a DNA unquestionable proof for being a Kohen? And the answer, he says, is the answer to the first question is rather complex, and there are more than one valid opinion on the issue. Okay, so you're just saying that there's more than one valid opinion on the first issue. The second question is simpler and agree that the DNA Cohen test is no valid proof for halakha requirements, and how much more so not a proof of Jewishness in the case of non-Jewish parents, which was what the referred answer is dealing with. So again, the basic thing was someone asked them a question concerning DNA. So the first question basically being, that can you use DNA to prove something halakhically for a descent of Jewishness? And the Rebbe's answer is that it's a complex answer. Now, the other issue that one has to take into account is what was mentioned in terms of the Cohen DNA testing. And that's basically that halakhically speaking, no, we don't use DNA to prove if someone's a Cohen or not, because essentially just because your DNA shows up as a Cohen, and even if it was 3,000 years ago, how your parents were married and how your grandparents were married plays into a part of determining whether someone's a valid Cohen or not. So essentially, the Ancestry corporate website also does present some information on this. And I'm not going to go over every little detail here, but basically what it says at the end, and that's what I've highlighted, is that essentially documentation is how Jews go by determining who is Jewish or not, ancestrally, and who's also related to this and that. Because again, DNA testing is not how we judge these matters, because DNA testing doesn't tell you if your parents are married correctly. DNA testing doesn't tell if a person is a mamzer, which is a particular status which is produced by two parents who are Jewish but who are not allowed to marry each other, or in some and essentially their children would be considered mamzerim. If the Torah says it's asur, forbidden for them to be married, and they marry and have kids, then their kids have a certain designation. Well, DNA testing can't tell you something like that. DNA testing can't tell you, for example, that somewhere down the line, a particular mother of a particular child was not Jewish, but the father was, and then, like, let's say maybe the children married back in the Jewish community. It can't tell you any of those kind of things, and it can't tell you if someone like who was a Cohen married someone who was divorced. Those kind of things you get from information that confirms what the relationships of the previous generations were, and not from DNA testing. So why is this even an issue? And the reason why it's an issue is because one of the people who's commented on one of my videos says that they genetically come from the descendants of Avraham, of Abraham, as they said, and that modern day Jews do not. But the funny thing is that the only way you could ever say you were a genetic descendant of Abraham is to actually have the DNA of Abraham. And no DNA testing has been done on the body of Abraham, simply because we know the area that he's buried in, but we don't have any identification of his bones or of of whatever material may have been left. And based upon the way he was buried, from the description in the Torah, essentially all would be left by now would be bones. But again, that was so long ago that you wouldn't be finding anything that you can identify specifically as the bones of Avraham ben Terach. So essentially, we Jews of today are descendants of Abraham because of the fact that we have a track record or information that points us in that direction. That even if a person wanted to say that Jews in one location or not, essentially it'd be hard to say that about every single Jew on all over the planet who has that as their genetic written and oral transmission, but not like specifically as like a DNA test proving it out. So again, that's it's kind of a meaningless thing. But if somebody wants to say that they're genetically connected to someone from 3,000 years ago from which they have no genetic material, that's perfectly fine by us. You can do whatever you want. Because one of the things that's important from at least the Torath Mosheh Jewish perspective is that that all of us today, all Jews today, are descendants of not just the what we call the Avot, meaning that our ancestors that are mentioned in the Torah and the Tanakh, but we're also descendants of people who mixed in with the Avot. So what that means is that we're also descendants of the people who we consider to be avot, and also people who became gerim, meaning the people from different nations that basically converted to the Torah and mixed into the Jewish nation after they were converted to the Torah. And that's what produces all Jewish ancestries today that are connected to Torath Mosheh communities. So essentially, the sign of a Jew, as far as we're concerned, the sign of someone who keeps the Torah, is being able to say, okay, these are my parents, they keep the Torah. These are my grandparents, they keep the Torah. And the actual practices, having families that produce children who keep the Torah, and visibly can be determined as being Jewish. And also people who convert to the Torah, become gerim, and marry into the Jewish community. This is the identifying marks of someone. And genetics don't really portray that, because you could have someone who has a certain genetic makeup, if you will, who for generations there's been no one who's ever physically, visually been able to be marked as someone who keeps the Torah. And the Torah actually specifies that as the methodology and not like specifically just bloodlines. And the reason here, because is the Torah defines how Jews, particularly live out our lives daily on a personal level, a seasonal level, judicially, and also in terms of a national sense. So what a person would be looking through is saying, okay, when I look through a Jewish family library, do I see these kind of texts? Do I see certain practices? That's the thing that would identify it. And this comes from Jewish law. And also, when a person is looking at the leadership of Jewish communities, that leadership looks a certain way. But even if it doesn't look a certain way in terms of its physicality, in terms of there's no such thing as like facial structures that basically say someone's Jewish, but it's how they live their lives and how they lead their communities. And those looks, in terms of how they lead their communities, can come from a number of spectrums. Because again, the Jewish people have been diversified because of the fact that in every location where Jews travel to, there were always people who converted, became gerim, and married into the Jewish people. And that's something that is, a proud reality of every Jewish community, and was one of the reasons that Jews in different locations look different in some cases, because of the fact that, there's been a genetic mixed bag, if you will. So in summary, essentially for those who want to leave messages about how they are genetically one thing or the other, if that's what you believe, that's perfectly fine. I'm not here to argue with you, and I'm not even here to really get involved in that, because that is not pertinent to anything that I deal with, and it doesn't have any like real importance in the Jewish community that keeps Torah. The Torah community is more, I guess, concerned with, as well as would be more impressed with, someone who says, I keep the Torah. If someone says, okay, I read it from a Torah scroll, here's my Torah scroll. I read in Hebrew, here's my Hebrew. I teach my children Hebrew. I teach my children the ways of Hashem. I teach my children the halakha. Those things impress people in my community more than anything else. And simply genetics don't really impress anybody, because if we have a conversation about genetics, we could finish that within 5 minutes and be done, and then have nothing else to ever conversate about. But when talking about the Torah, we as Jews spend from the cradle to the grave dealing with Torah. So that's what's more important. So again, this is Ehav Ever from the Chronicles of Ehav Ever. Thank you. Bye.